Hey everybody, this is Scott, and before we dive right into the Scott Stedman podcast, I want to go ahead and make a quick announcement for you. Since 2008, when I started doing podcasts with my friend Ryan, and we went from theology and backgammon to actually turning it into the Scott Stedman podcast, I have been fully funding this podcast from the website to all the equipment, the software, everything. I have been doing this to kind of help run the podcast. However, with me not working and me going through a lot of different transitions, this is an opportunity for you guys, the listeners, to help support the Scott Stedman podcast. So what I did is I set up a coffee account, and you could go on there, you can check it out, you can sponsor me, whether it's a one-time donation or if you want to do a monthly donation, and basically any funds that come through the coffee account are solely going to go to the betterment of the podcast. So that means being able to have bigger interviews, being able to have more than one guest and kind of do more of a roundtable discussion on the different topics that I discuss on my podcast. This allows me to maybe update some of my streaming software and be able to do kind of a live feed of doing these podcasts. So there's a lot of different things that are coming up in the future. So if you would like to help support the podcast, just go ahead and go to coffee.com. That is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Again, that is coffee, ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you guys so much for your love and support for all these years. And now let's get to the show. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Today, I want to talk about the movie Encanto. And if you haven't seen the movie Encanto, check it out. I know it's been a while since I last did a film for thought. So I want to talk about this movie Encanto because there's a lot of great stuff in this movie. Now, according to Walt Disney press release, this detailing what this movie is about. It says, Encanto tells a tale of an extraordinary family, the Madrigals, who live hidden in the mountains of Colombia in a magical house in a vibrant town in a wondrous, charmed place called an Encanto. The magic of the Encanto has blessed every child in the family with a unique gift from super strength to the power to heal every child except one, Mirabel. But when she discovers that the magic surrounding the Encanto is in danger, Mirabel decides that she, the only ordinary Madrigal, might just be her exceptional family's last hope. So that's a pretty good description, but I also feel like it doesn't give the story of Encanto justice, as it speaks volumes to bridging the gap in relationships, especially between different generations that we see with inside family units. But I also see this as a way of bridging the gap for church leaders to kind of build that generational gap within their churches. So if you haven't seen Encanto already, you might want to pause, maybe bookmark this, watch the movie, and then listen, because I'm going to reveal a bunch of spoilers. So make sure you're, I don't want to spoil anything for you. So you have been warned. So when we look at Mirabel, Mirabel is the only one who does not have a gift that was bestowed on her by the miracle candle. And because of this fact, her family treats her differently, especially her abuela. However, she begins to have these visions of the family falling apart by seeing cracks within the Encanto. Later on in the movie, you start to learn about Bruno, who is a kind of an outcast of the family, and Maribel's kind of the outcast as we're seeing in there. So she ends up seeking out Bruno to investigate this vision, because one of the things we see in this vision is we see kind of the house cracking. And within this mirror pieces, what you're seeing is you're kind of seeing Maribel at the center of not only the house being in ruins, but also the house being at whole. And it's one of those things where you can look at that and you can easily interpret Maribel's either the savior or she is the destruction of the Encanto. So as she finds Bruno, she ends up going to help her find a deeper meaning to this vision. So as she investigates investigate this deeper, you find that the interpretation is that Maribel is supposed to bring healing to her family, not destruction. So this is very great. However, Bruno even says, well, even though you're supposed to bring healing, the family's not going to see it that way. And as Maribel goes and starts beginning the healing process for her family, she comes to a head with her abuela, which ends up causing a catastrophe within the family, thus causing ruin in the Encanto. And then later on, Bella ends up finding Maribel and begins to tell her how ever since she lost her husband, she has been desperately trying to keep her family together. And as Maribel is listening to Abuela's story, she begins to understand Abuela's hopes and fears and why she held on to this miracle for so long. And then Maribel begins to not only acknowledge Abuela's hard work and the sacrifice that she had for her family, but then she begins to reassure her that, hey, there's this new foundation that can bring a lot of healing for the family, that can help preserve the family and also grow their legacy. And eventually, towards the end of the movie, we begin to see reconciliation, and then the family is restored. Now, when I look at this story, it really speaks to me when it comes to the church. Because one of the biggest conflicts in the church today is this concept of change, and especially trying to change the culture within your individual churches, whether it is your local church, whether it is within your denomination or the higher echelons of your church structure. But change is always something that happens that ends up bringing a lot of resistance. And we see leaders go to these conferences and they read these articles on the next wave of church leadership and discipleship and worship and church growth. And as these changes begin to take place, one of the things we see is we begin to see that there's opposition within the church when these leaders bring this information back, especially with your more older, established church goers or your generations. And eventually the cracks begin to show, and either we begin to see church members leave, or we see church leaders resign due to burnout, spiritual woundedness, or even there's a falling out, or even like a moral failing takes place. And this begins to create a cycle of churches and their leaders continuing to do a tug-of-war match that eventually leads to death and destruction. I was talking to a buddy of mine, and we were talking about certain things with churches and kind of understanding some of the dynamics of certain churches. And it was very interesting because this one church came up that we were talking about, and it was a church that I've applied to and didn't get, which is fine. It's a church that one of my friends, her father was the pastor there for a couple times, and then he ended up leaving to go somewhere else. And then the guy I was talking to led worship there. And as we were talking about things, I kind of told the story, kind of a funny story on, why kind of not only me not getting this position, but then also kind of the aftermath from it, which was quite comical. He made this comment. He goes, there's nobody who's ever going to be good enough to lead that church. It's like they're waiting for the perfect individual, the perfect person to step inside that pulpit to help lead change in the church, and yet they're never going to be satisfied with whoever steps behind that pulpit. And I find that very fascinating, because on one side you do see that culture with a congregation where, and even with some of the leaders within the congregation, where there is kind of that mentality, like, this is our church, we know the culture, this person that's coming in doesn't know the church like we know the church, so we're going to educate this person who's coming in, who we're hiring to help lead us to the next chapter in this church's history, but yet we're going to tell them what to do. I was listening to the podcast series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and if you haven't checked it out, you should go and check it out. It's a really great listen to. But as we were listening to it, they had some footage of Mark Driscoll and talking to a bunch of church leaders. And basically he made the comment, says, the Mars Hill bus has a pile of bodies behind it, and by the grace of God, there will be a couple more added to it. So you're either on the bus or you're off the bus. And if you're off the bus, you're probably going to get hit by the bus. And the shocking thing that I heard from that is that as he said that, there was no one who said anything. Not a rebuke, not even a laugh, not even anything. But it was just like he says this, and like everyone just kind of went along with what he was saying, like it was a normal part of church leadership. And sometimes we see that it's more about progress at the expense of human connection. The issue that I think, and this is what I think, is that church leaders do a horrible job in listening to the voices of the older generation, as they have a lot of fear and hopes for the church that seem to go unheard. And I'm sure, I can even think about all the times and all the statements I have made when I was an intern, whether I was a church leader, even if I was just a casual churchgoer that would hang out with the pastor or do something. There would always be these things where when someone from the older generation would have a complaint, it was almost like, oh, okay, yeah. And they just kind of brushed them off. It was just like, you would say something that kind of appeased them in that moment, and then you just completely would just forget everything that they said. And I think the problem is with that kind of that culture, kind of that approach to church leadership, is that when a pastor or an elder or somebody does that, what happens is that person starts to hold on tightly to those traditions of the church, and they begin to fight against any change because they are afraid that whatever bad things could happen to the church, especially since they have invested so much of their lives in, that they don't want to let that stuff go. Because, I've been a member of this church for 50, 60 years. I've invested into this church. And the fact that this new person or this next leader's coming in and wants to change everything, and even though I have some concerns or some questions, and they're just like, and they just kind of brush me off, that kind of works against everything. And I think when we look back to the story of Encanto and looking at that interaction between Abuela and Maribel, one of the things I see is Maribel's kind of that wise leader. She not only listened to the voice of the past and acknowledges and understands their traditions and kind of the things that they hold so dear, but at the same time, they're also able to reassure him that the changes that are taking place are not some part of a church fad, but it's a way to set the church in motion for fruitful discipleship and community impact to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ to the next generation. So the wise leader reassures that the older generation will not be an afterthought in the life of the church, but they are a vital part. And as the tools are given to the next generation to continue to build up the church, and as the younger generation is able to build up the church and the older generation is able to feel heard, able to feel like their concerns or fears are acknowledged and are reassured, and they're able to see the work, then I think when they're able to see everything work out and they're able to see the picture and they're able to get behind the vision, then that is really the catalyst for fruitful ministry and a fruitful catalyst to bridging that generational gap between younger and older generations within the church. So again, I think it's about effective listening, it's about empathy, and it's about reassurance that the past work is valuable. And yet something new can be built upon that foundation that is already there. So for the church leader, here is kind of my plea to you. Here's kind of my begging you, I guess, in some way. My advice, my wisdom to you as you're trying to lead a church. Don't get too far ahead on the mission of the vision that you have before you. Don't get so far ahead that you have forgot the value of your older generation and the contributions that they have made to the church. Do not forget that. Acknowledge it, and acknowledge it to them, because that is going to be important. Now, for the congregation, for those of you who are not in leadership, who are kind of, sorry, my hair's just getting wild today. I'm too busy touching my hair. But for those of you who are in the congregation, remember that there is a time to build. And there is a time to pass down the tools to the next generation for them to build up the church in a way to witness and impact their generation and future generations for the kingdom of God. I mean, that's kind of the big thing, because what I hear, and I mean, this is a whole other podcast episode, and I may do this with some of my friends who to kind of bounce back and forth with, but I always hear from older generation, people don't come to church. Younger people don't go to church anymore. They just don't come to church. And yet, I think one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest problems is the reason why the younger generation doesn't come to church is because they are not valued. Because they come to church, and you want young people to come to church. You want their kids to be a part of the church life. You want everything about them to be integral to the church life. But when it comes to the movement forward, when it comes to trying to build something, because again, I think the young generation that are attending church, they want to build something so that they can go to their generation, their friends, the people they ran with in high school and in college, and even just other young families they meet during play dates or at the park or wherever. They want to say, hey, we have a place for you and we want to minister to you. But when they bring people in, and it's just always the older generation doing their thing, doing their ministry, and not allowing that younger generation to rise up, or rise up to an extent but still kind of know your place, then that's why younger generations are not attending church, because they don't feel like that they are a part. They feel like that they're just kind of there to kind of help, but they have no controlling interest in the future of the church and how it's going to impact their generation and eventually impact the kingdom of God. So we have to change that mindset. We have to change that culture. And I think the key is that as leaders, we have to kind of be the Maribel. We have to be able to listen to the abuelas in our congregations, listen to them, empathize with them, reassure them, and then move them forward in the vision and the ministry that God has set before you to do the kingdom work within your church. So guys, thank you so much. I appreciate each and every one of you. If you have not already heard, whether through social media postings or anything, I have set up a Ko-fi account. This is a way for you guys to help me fund this podcast. Since 2008, I have funded the podcast completely. However, a lot of my equipment's getting older. And again, this is just a way for me to kind of do upkeep and maintenance on the podcast. None of the funds that are being donated, if you sign up for a Ko-fi account, rest assured that this money's not going to me for me to go and buy food, for me to go and have a lavish lifestyle. Every dollar that is donated through the Ko-fi account, or the coffee account, however you say it, that goes directly to the maintenance and the upkeep of the Scott Stedman podcast. This allow me to do bigger interviews, maybe do more group roundtable interviews, upgrade some of my equipment, maybe update some of my streaming stuff so that I could probably do more of a live stream with my podcast instead of just pre-recording and then editing a video and even an audio for the podcast. So guys, this is very helpful, and if you've listened to this podcast, if you've appreciated everything I've been doing, just feel free to give. I mean, as low as you can give is $1, so that would be helpful. So guys, again, thank you guys so much for listening to me. I'm truly blessed by each and every one of you that listen to this podcast. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll have a next podcast for you on Friday. Take care, and God bless.